Viper suckin' your root. The Apache girl shrieked, eyes locked on my crotch. I froze. It was just a rope, but the distraction cost us blood. Now she's rotting with fever, tunic crusted black with pus. We re-tracking a map drawn in preacher's blood, leaving nothing but corpses behind us. When the next frontier yarn rolls out on Dusty Trail Stories, listen close, leave your mark in the comments, and swear yourself to that subscribe. The canyon floor held heat like a furnace, the jagged walls of black basalt trapping the air until every breath felt baked dry in the throat. It was the high summer of 1881, and the New Mexico Territory was a place where silence usually meant danger, though Ethan Graves had allowed himself to forget that for the briefest of moments. At 47 years of age, with joints that ached when the rain was coming and hands that had only recently stopped trembling from the want of whiskey, Ethan sat with his back pressed against the scorching sandstone, a tin cup of coffee raised halfway to his lips. He was enjoying the rare stillness of the Valley of Fires, watching a hawk circle the thermal currents, when the morning shattered. A rifle crack echoed like a whip crack through the narrow passage, and the tin cup in his hand exploded, showering him with scalding grounds and jagged metal. Ethan moved with the instinct of a man who had spent half his life being shot at. He rolled sideways into the dust, his old Colt Peacemaker clearing leather before his shoulder even hit the dirt. From his position behind a ridge of volcanic rock, he peered through the shimmering heat haze and spotted 3 riders prowling the ravine below. Leading them was a man in a long duster, a man with a face Ethan had hoped never to see again outside of his nightmares. It was Durand, the officer who had left their unit to die in a box canyon 10 years ago, now hunting Ethan with the cold determination of a man settling old scores. Ethan checked the cylinder of his revolver. 5 rounds remained, enough for a man who made every shot count, but hardly enough for a war. He spat dust from his mouth, muttering a curse against the territory and his own foolishness for stopping to rest in such a godforsaken gulch. Just as he thumbed back the hammer, a flash of movement in the periphery caught his eye. A woman emerged from the shadows of the rocks to his left, moving with the silence of a ghost. She was Apache, dressed in worn buckskin that clung to her lean frame, her eyes fierce and terrified. Before Ethan could signal her to stay down, she froze, her gaze locking onto his waist with unmistakable horror. "Snake!" She cried out in heavily accented English, her voice shrill and echoing off the canyon walls. "Rattlesnake, between your legs." Ethan glanced down in panic, expecting to see death coiled and ready to strike, but saw only his stiff, sun-darkened lariat hanging from his hip. In the harsh glare of the midday sun, the coiled rope did indeed resemble a serpent ready to strike, but her warning had cost them the element of surprise. Down in the ravine, Durand's head snapped up. "Found you, Graves!" the bounty hunter shouted, raising his Winchester. Ethan shoved the woman behind the cover of the rock just as bullets began to chip away the stone around them, sending sharp fragments flying like shrapnel. In one fluid motion, Ethan rose to a knee, aimed, and fired, his first shot striking one of the hired guns in the shoulder and spinning him around in the saddle. The woman, recovering from her confusion, realized her mistake but wasted no time. She hurled a hunting knife with deadly accuracy, pinning the second man's sleeve to his saddle horn as he tried to draw. "This way!" Ethan bellowed over the roar of gunfire, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a narrow fissure in the rock face. They scrambled up the scree, boots slipping on loose stone, as Durand's bullets kicked up dust at their heels. As they squeezed through the gap and onto a hidden ledge, leaving the shouting men below, Ethan looked at the woman, then down at the rope on his hip, and finally back to her. "It is a rope," he rasped, his chest heaving from the exertion. "Just a rope." The woman, Lona, stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, a mix of adrenaline and embarrassment flushing her cheeks as she pulled her knife from her belt, preparing for whatever came next in this unforgiving land. The entrance to the old mine was little more than a jagged scar in the cliff face, hidden behind a tangle of dry mesquite and tumbled boulders that had fallen from the rim long ago. Ethan Graves and the woman, Lona, scrambled into the darkness, leaving the blinding glare of the New Mexico sun behind them as if stepping into another world entirely. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth, stale copper, and the lingering, ghostly scent of men who had toiled here 20 years prior. They moved deep enough to lose the daylight, guided only by the echo of their own ragged breathing and the crunch of gravel under their boots. Ethan struck a lucifer match against the rough stone wall, the sudden flare of sulfur illuminating a tunnel shored up with rotting timbers that groaned under the weight of the mountain. In the flickering yellow light, the adrenaline that had carried them up the canyon wall began to ebb, leaving behind a throbbing ache in Ethan's knees and a sharp, stinging awareness of the silence. He turned to check on the woman, raising the match to cast light on her face, and that was when he saw the dark stain spreading across the side of her buckskin tunic. The fabric was slick and heavy with blood, plastered against her ribs. "You are hurt," Ethan said, his voice sounding too loud in the confined space, the gravel in his throat scratching against the words. Lona looked down, her hand pressing against her side, her face pale beneath the sheen of sweat and dust. "It is nothing," she murmured, though a wince betrayed her as she leaned heavily against a support beam. "A graze. A scratch." Ethan shook his head, the match burning down to his fingertips before he shook it out and lit another. "Sit," he commanded, not unkindly, pointing to a flat slab of rock near a trickle of water that seeped from a fissure in the wall. "I was a scout for the army, and I have seen scratches kill good men when the fever takes them." Lona hesitated, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of treachery, but she found only the weary concern of a man who had seen too much blood to ignore it. She sank onto the stone, her breath hitching as she shifted her weight. Ethan knelt beside her, unbuttoning his duster and pulling a clean, albeit wrinkled, bandana from his pocket. He wet the cloth in the cold seep, the water turning the fabric dark. "I need to see the wound," he said, his hands hovering uncertainly. Lona watched him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and then, with slow, deliberate movements, she untied the leather lacings at her side. As the buckskin fell away, revealing the smooth, copper skin of her waist and the angry red furrow where the bullet had torn through flesh, the atmosphere in the damp cave shifted violently. It was no longer just a medical necessity, it became an intrusion of intimacy in a world of violence. Ethan leaned in, the smell of rain and sage rising from her skin, overpowering the metallic tang of the mine. He pressed the cold, wet cloth against the angry welt, and Lona gasped, her hand instinctively flying out to grip his shoulder. Her fingers dug into the worn fabric of his shirt, clutching the muscle beneath. The contact sent a jolt through Ethan that had nothing to do with the cold water. He froze for a second, his eyes lifting to meet hers. In the dim light, the distance between them vanished. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, a stark contrast to the chill of the cave. His rough, calloused thumb brushed against the soft, unblemished skin just below the wound, a touch that was meant to steady her but lingered a moment too long. Lona did not pull away. Her pupils were dilated, swallowing the darkness, and her breathing synced with his, ragged and shallow. For a man who had spent 3 years in solitary penance, avoiding the touch of another human being, the sensation was overwhelming, a sudden, drowning wave of desire that terrified him more than Durand's bullets. The silence stretched, heavy and electric, charged with a raw, unspoken need that pulsed between them like a heartbeat. He could see the pulse fluttering in the hollow of her throat, could feel the tension in her thigh where it brushed against his knee. It would have been easy, so terribly easy, to lean forward the last 3 inches, to let the danger of the moment spill over into passion, to find oblivion in the warmth of her rather than the bottom of a bottle. But the memory of the badge he once wore, and the ghosts that watched him from the shadows, held him back. Ethan cleared his throat, the sound harsh and jarring, and focused his eyes back on the wound, wrapping the bandana tight and tying it off with hands that shook slightly. "Bullet just grazed the rib," he said, his voice lower, huskier than before. "You were lucky." Lona exhaled, a long, trembling sound, and released his shoulder, though her hand lingered in the air for a second before falling to her lap. She adjusted her tunic, covering the skin, but the air remained thick with what had almost happened. Lucky, she repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. Why does he hunt you, this man with the dead eyes? Ethan sat back on his heels, putting a safe distance between them, and pulled his canteen from his belt. Long story, he muttered, taking a drink and wiping his mouth. We rode together once. I left when the killing stopped making sense. He hunted me because I know what he is. And you? Why was he shooting at an Apache woman in the middle of nowhere? Lona studied him, weighing the truth against survival. She reached into the pouch at her waist and withdrew a piece of worn hide, etched with burnt markings. She held it out, not letting go, forcing him to lean in again to see it. A map, she whispered. To a silver mine. My father's secret. Ethan looked at the markings, his brow furrowing. He knew the look of a prospector's map, and he knew the look of military supply routes. The lines on the hide were too precise, the locations too strategic for simple ore. He looked up at her, seeing the defiance in her jaw and the fear she tried to hide. Silver, he challenged softly. Is that why you guard it with your life? Is that why a man like Durand, who cares only for power, is wasting bullets on you? Lona pulled the map back, tucking it away against her heart. It is what it is, she said, her voice hardening, rebuilding the walls that had momentarily crumbled. We are both outcasts, cowboy. Let that be enough truth for tonight. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting the lie because he had plenty of his own, and settled against the cold stone wall, watching the entrance of the cave as the light outside began to fade into violet dusk, knowing that the morning would bring fire. The town of Solitude emerged from the heat haze of the high desert like a collection of bleached bones left to dry in the sun, a scatter of timber and adobe that looked as if a stiff wind might blow it clear off the map. It had taken Ethan and Lona 2 hard days of riding through the backcountry to reach it, sticking to the dry washes and goat paths to avoid the main trails where Durand's riders would be watching. Their horses were lathered and blowing hard, their heads low, and the riders looked little better. Dust had settled into the deep lines of Ethan's face like mortar, and Lona rode with a stiffness that spoke of the pain in her side, though she had not complained once since they left the mine. As they guided their mounts down the single, rutted main street, the silence of the town felt heavy and judging. Solitude was a place where curiosity was a vice and strangers were treated like a contagion. Men sitting on the porch of the livery stable stopped their whittling to stare, their eyes tracking the Apache woman with a mixture of hostility and dark fascination. Ethan pulled his hat brim lower, his hand resting casually near the walnut grip of his peacemaker, a silent warning to anyone foolish enough to let their prejudice turn into action. They pulled up in front of the Frontier Hotel, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a false front that leaned precariously toward the street. Stay close, Ethan murmured, dismounting and looping the reins over the hitching rail. Towns like this, they do not take kindly to differences. Lona slid from her saddle, wincing as her boots hit the dirt, but her chin remained high, her eyes scanning the shadows with the wariness of a hunted animal. Inside, the lobby smelled of stale tobacco smoke, lemon polish, and the sour reek of old beer drifting in from the adjacent saloon. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous tick in his left eye, looked up from his ledger and sneered when he saw Lona. We do not rent to Indians, he stated flatly, closing the book with a thud. Ethan leaned across the counter, his movement slow and deliberate, invading the man's space until the clerk could smell the dust and dried blood on him. You are renting to me, Ethan said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. And she is with me. Unless you want to explain to the sheriff why his old friend Ethan Graves had to dismantle your establishment. The clerk swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and reached for a brass key on the board behind him. Room 4, he squeaked. Upstairs, end of the hall. Ethan took the key, tossing a silver dollar onto the wood, the coin spinning and settling with a ring that sounded too loud in the empty lobby. The room was small, stiflingly hot, and contained little more than a narrow iron bed, a wash basin, and a wardrobe that smelled of mothballs. Ethan helped Lona sit on the edge of the mattress, pouring water from the pitcher into a glass. I need to find Blackwood, he said, checking the loads in his revolver. He is the law here. We rode together in the 65th. If there is anyone in this territory who can help us, it is him. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me. Lona nodded, taking the water, her eyes dark with worry. Trust is a dangerous thing, Ethan, she warned softly. Ethan paused at the door. It is the only thing we have left. He walked the short distance to the sheriff's office, the boardwalk creaking under his boots. The office was cool and dim, the shades drawn against the afternoon glare. William Blackwood sat behind a scarred oak desk, cleaning a shotgun with a rag soaked in oil. He looked older than Ethan remembered, his waist thicker, his hair receding, but the eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, blue as a winter sky. When the door opened, Blackwood looked up, his hand freezing on the weapon, before a grin split his face, a grin that showed too many teeth. Ethan Graves, he drawled, rising to extend a hand. I heard the telegraph wires buzzing about a mess down south, but I never thought you would be the one stirring the pot. Ethan shook the hand, the grip was firm, but the palm was sweaty. Good to see you, Bill, Ethan lied, the uneasiness in his gut coiling tighter. I need a place to lay low for a night. Got some trouble on my back trail. Blackwood chuckled, gesturing to a chair. Trouble is your middle name, Ethan. Is it true what they say? You got a savage with you. A woman? Ethan stiffened, his eyes narrowing. She is a witness, Bill. To a massacre. Durand and his boys, they are not just hunting bounties anymore. They are moving weapons. Blackwood's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something cold passing behind his eyes before the mask of the jovial lawman slipped back into place. Weapons, you say? That is a serious accusation. And this woman, she knows where they are. Ethan nodded slowly, watching his old friend. She has a map. We are taking it to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. Blackwood whistled low, leaning back in his chair, the wood groaning. Santa Fe is a long ride, Ethan. Dangerous country. You two stay at the hotel. I will post a deputy outside. Nobody will touch you here. He stood up, walking to the window and peering out through the slats. You just rest. I will handle Durand if he shows his face. Ethan stood, thanking him, but as he turned to leave, his gaze fell on the desk. Half hidden under a stack of wanted posters was a telegram, the paper fresh and crisp. The visible text read, Stop Graves. Secure map. Payment upon delivery. The sender's name was obscured, but the origin station was the very outpost where Durand operated. Ethan felt a cold chill wash over him, sharper than any winter wind. He forced himself to walk out the door, his gait steady, pretending he had seen nothing. He did not go back to the hotel immediately. Instead, he slipped into the alleyway between the saloon and the general store, circling back toward the rear of the sheriff's office. The sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows that stretched across the dust like reaching fingers. He crouched beneath the open back window of the jailhouse, the smell of privies and rotting garbage thick in the air. Inside, he heard the heavy thud of boots and the strike of a match. Then, a voice he recognized, not Blackwood's, but the rough, gravelly tone of one of Durand's lieutenants. He is here. The voice asked. Upstairs at the frontier, Blackwood replied, his tone devoid of the earlier warmth. Room 4. He has the girl. And the map? That is what Durand wants to know. Does she have the map? Blackwood laughed, a harsh, dry sound. She would not be breathing if she did not. I will wait until they are asleep. No need for a ruckus in the street. I will take the map, slip a knife in their ribs, and you can tell Durand his troubles are over. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a cold, murderous rage. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. He moved silently away from the window, the shadows swallowing him as he sprinted back toward the hotel, taking the back stairs 2 at a time. He tapped the secret knock on the door of room 4, 2 quick raps, 1 slow. The lock clicked, and Lona pulled him inside, her knife already in her hand. "We have to go," Ethan whispered, his voice urgent. "Blackwood is with them. He sold us out." Before Lona could reply, the heavy tread of boots sounded in the hallway, not the stealthy approach of an assassin, but the confident stride of men who owned the law. There were too many of them to fight in the open. "Hide," Ethan breathed, shoving Lona toward the narrow wardrobe. He squeezed in after her, pulling the wooden doors shut just as the lock of the hotel room clicked and the handle turned. The interior of the wardrobe was cramped and smelled of cedar and old lavender. There was no room for daylight between them. Ethan stood with his back to the wood, Lona pressed tightly against him, her back to his chest, his arms instinctively caging her to keep her steady. Through the slats of the wardrobe door, thin slices of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The door to the room opened with a creak, and heavy footsteps entered. Ethan held his breath, feeling Lona's heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The intruders moved around the room, overturning the mattress, opening the washstand. "They are gone," a voice growled, "Blackwood. The window is open. They must have gone out the roof." A second set of footsteps approached the wardrobe. The handle rattled. Ethan's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his knuckles white. In the crushing dark, the terror of discovery was compounded by the overwhelming physical reality of their proximity. Lona was trembling, not just from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through her. Her head was tipped back against Ethan's shoulder, her hair tickling his chin. He could feel the warmth of her hips pressed against his, the rise and fall of her chest sinking with his own. It was a terrifying intimacy, forced upon them by the threat of death. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, but the deeper instinct was to protect, to hold her silent and safe. The intruder pulled on the wardrobe handle again, but the latch stuck, a small miracle of rust and neglect. "Leave it," Blackwood commanded from the window. "They are running. Get the horses. We will run them down in the open country." The footsteps retreated, the door slammed shut, and silence returned to the room, heavy and suffocating. But inside the wardrobe, they did not move. The danger had passed, but the tension remained, coiled and hot. Ethan did not let go. His hands were still on her waist, and for a long moment, neither of them dared to break the contact, bound together in the dark by a betrayal that had stripped away the last of their safety and left them with nothing but each other and the night. The silence in the wardrobe had been a heavy, suffocating thing, but the silence that followed the departure of Sheriff Blackwood and his men was of a different breed entirely. It was the sharp, brittle silence of a fuse burning down to the powder. Ethan Graves kicked the door of the wardrobe open, his lungs greedily pulling in the stale air of the hotel room as if it were sweet mountain breeze. Lona stumbled out after him, her face slick with sweat, her dark eyes wide not with fear, but with a cold, focused fury that mirrored his own. There was no time for words, no time to discuss the betrayal that still stung like a fresh brand on Ethan's pride. They moved as one, a singular entity driven by the desperate need for survival. Ethan went to the window, peering through the slats of the shutters. The street below was bathed in the long, melancholic shadows of twilight, the dust turning purple and gray. Blackwood's deputies were gathering near the livery stable, their silhouettes jagged against the fading light, blocking the direct path to the horses. To go out the front was suicide, to stay was death. "We go through the back," Ethan whispered, checking the cylinder of his Colt for the third time, a nervous habit that had returned with a vengeance. "Through the alley, cut across the yard of the saloon, and take the horses from the rear paddock before they know we are gone." Lona nodded, checking the balance of her knife, her expression grim. They slipped out of the room, leaving the door unlocked, and crept down the back stairs, the wood groaning under their boots like the bones of an old man. The alley behind the hotel was a narrow throat of darkness, smelling of rotting vegetable peels and the sour mash waste from the saloon next door. The sounds of the town were beginning to swell, the tinny, discordant jangle of a piano, the raucous laughter of men trying to drink away the memory of the day's labor, and the sharp clink of bottle against glass. It was the sound of the frontier at night, a chaotic symphony of vice and desperation. They moved through the shadows, keeping close to the rough-hewn timber walls, Ethan leading, his body angled to shield Lona. They reached the rear door of the establishment known as the Rusty Nail, a place Ethan had avoided for 3 years, a place where the floorboards were stained dark with tobacco spit and spilled blood. The plan was simple: skirt the edge of the building and make for the paddock. But plans in the territory had a way of dying the moment the first boot hit the dirt. As they passed the open back door, a massive figure stumbled out, retching, blocking their path. He was a drover, smelling of cattle and cheap rye, his eyes bleary and unfocused until they landed on Lona. He blinked, a slow, bovine realization dawning on his face, which quickly twisted into a sneer of drunken hostility. "Well now," he slurred, wiping his mouth with a dirty sleeve. "Look what the rats dragged out of the dark. An Indian. In my town." He lunged, not for a weapon, but for Lona, his hand grasping for her arm with clumsy entitlement. Ethan did not hesitate. The violence that erupted was not the calculated maneuvering of a soldier, but the brutal, efficient reflex of a survivor. He stepped in, driving the heel of his boot into the man's knee with a sickening crunch of cartilage. The drover howled, a sound that cut through the alley noise, and crumbled. But the damage was done. The howl had alerted the men inside. The back door swung wide, spilling yellow lantern light into the alley, illuminating Ethan and Lona like actors on a stage. "Hey!" someone shouted. "That is Graves. And the girl." There was no choice now. The paddock was cut off. Into the saloon. Ethan yelled, shoving Lona through the very door the men were pouring out of. It was madness, a tactical nightmare, but it was the only way to break the line of sight from the deputies outside. They burst into the main room of the Rusty Nail, the sudden entrance silencing the piano and freezing the room. The air was thick, a physical wall of heat, smoke, and the smell of unwashed bodies. 40 pairs of eyes turned to them. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of the gas lamps and the rattle of a glass being set down on the bar. Then, recognition rippled through the room. The wanted posters had done their work. "That is him." A voice cried out from the poker table. "And the Apache witch." The tension snapped. Chairs scraped violently against the floorboards as men stood, hands dropping to holsters. Ethan grabbed a heavy oak table and flipped it on its side, shoving Lona behind it just as the first shot rang out, burying itself in the wood inches from his head. "Get down!" he roared, returning fire. His first shot took out the oil lamp hanging above the bar, plunging the far side of the room into semi-darkness and sending a spray of hot oil and glass over the bartender. Chaos descended. It was a brawl of the old breed, where gunfire mixed with the dull thud of fists and the crash of breaking furniture. Ethan was a whirlwind, a force of nature unleashed after years of repression. He moved with a fluidity that belied his age, dodging a wild haymaker from a burly miner and countering with a pistol whip to the temple that dropped the man cold. But there were too many of them. They were surrounded by a mob fueled by whiskey and the promise of a reward. Lona was not idle, she moved like a shadow in the chaos, her knife flashing. A cowboy tried to grab her hair, and she spun, slashing his forearm, sending him reeling back with a scream. They were backed against the bar now, the mob pressing in, the air filled with the deafening roar of Colt 45s and Winchester rifles. Ethan's hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He cursed, shoving the gun into his holster and grabbing a discarded whiskey bottle from the bar top. He smashed it over the head of an attacker, the amber liquid spraying like blood. It was then, in the brief flash of a muzzle flare, that Ethan saw it. Behind the bar, in a glass-fronted case meant to amuse the patrons, was a massive diamondback rattlesnake, coiled and agitated by the vibration of the fight. The glass was already cracked from a stray bullet. Ethan looked at Lona, and she saw it too. A shared look of desperate understanding passed between them. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice with the devil. Lona grabbed a heavy iron spittoon and hurled it with all her strength at the case. The glass shattered outward. The snake, furious and confused, dropped onto the bar top, its rattle buzzing like a saw, a sound that cut through the din of the fight. Snake! Someone screamed, the primal fear of the serpent overriding the lust for violence. The mob recoiled, men stumbling over each other to get away from the bar. In that moment of confusion, the dynamic of the room shifted. The snake struck, sinking its fangs into the hand of a man raising a shotgun, causing him to fire blindly into the ceiling. The distraction was their salvation. Fire! Lona yelled, grabbing a lantern from the wall and throwing it hard onto the floor where the spilled high-proof whiskey had pooled. The flame caught instantly, roaring up with a whoosh of consuming heat, creating a wall of fire between them and the mob. The saloon filled with black, choking smoke. Coughing, eyes streaming, Ethan grabbed Lona's hand, his grip like iron. The back way was blocked, the front was a wall of fire, but the side window, high and narrow, was their only chance. Ethan boosted Lona up, she scrambled through, ignoring the glass that tore at her buckskin, and reached down to haul him after her. He vaulted through the opening, landing hard in the dust of the side street, the heat of the burning saloon hot on his back. They did not look back. They ran for the shadows of the livery stable, the screams of men and the crackle of timber consuming the night air. The confusion had bought them time, the deputies were rushing toward the fire, leaving the horses momentarily unguarded. Ethan threw a saddle onto a roan mare, his hands moving with frantic speed, while Lona mounted a Mustang that looked as wild as she felt. They kicked the horses into a gallop, bursting out of the stable doors and thundering down the main street, past the burning saloon, past the shouting men, and out into the open desert. The wind whipped at their faces, cooling the sweat and blood, but the adrenaline was still pumping, a drumbeat in their ears. They rode until the glow of the burning town was nothing but a faint orange smudge on the horizon, until the horses were blowing hard and the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the violence of men. Only then did they slow to a trot, the silence of the desert wrapping around them once more. But this was not the peace of the morning, it was the silence of the fugitive, a silence shared by two people who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, bound together now not just by a map, but by the knowledge that they were the only two souls in the territory who could rely on the other to survive the night. Ethan looked over at Lona in the moonlight, her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, unyielding life. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Graves did not feel the urge to drink, he felt only the overwhelming, terrifying urge to live. The journey to the foothills of the Oscura Mountains was a blur of heat and dust, a 2-day ride that tested the limits of both beast and rider. By the time the fortified ranch of Dr. Elias Harrison came into view, the horses were nearly foundered, their heads hanging low, foam flecking their chests like sea spray, and Lona was clinging to her saddle horn with a grip born of sheer, desperate will. The ranch itself was less a homestead and more a bastion against the wilderness, built of thick, native stone and heavy timber. It squatted against the base of a sheer cliff face, protecting its rear, while the front was guarded by a wall high enough to stop a horse and thick enough to stop a bullet. Ethan Graves slid from his saddle, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a dull thud that jarred his spine, his legs nearly buckling after 48 hours in the stirrups. He moved to Lona's side, catching her as she swayed, her skin radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. She was burning up, the infection from the graze and the exertion of the escape taking their toll. Ethan half carried her toward the heavy oak gates, shouting for the house. The slat in the gate slid open, revealing a pair of suspicious eyes and the twin barrels of a 12-gauge shotgun. "Identify yourself," a voice rasped, dry as old parchment. Ethan looked up, squinting against the glare. "It is Graves, Harrison." Open the gate. I have a wounded woman and half the territory on my tail. The bolt slid back with a heavy clank of iron on iron, and the gate swung inward to reveal Dr. Harrison. He was a tall man, gaunt as a scarecrow but made of sterner stuff, with a shock of white hair and hands that had dug as many bullets out of men as they had planted potatoes. He took one look at Lona, his face shifting from suspicion to professional concern, and waved them inside. Bring her to the surgery, he commanded, turning on his heel. The boys will see to the horses. Inside the main house, the air was cool and smelled of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and pipe tobacco, the scent of a man who lived alone and lived by his own rules. Ethan laid Lona on the long wooden table in the surgery room, his heart hammering against his ribs as Harrison began to cut away the blood-stiffened buckskin. Ethan paced the room, a caged wolf, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, his eyes darting to the windows where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. He felt useless here. In a gunfight, he was a god of small mercies and sudden deaths, but here, amidst the tinctures and the quiet murmur of the doctor, he was just a man who had failed to protect the one thing that mattered. Harrison worked with the swift economy of motion that came from years on the battlefield, cleaning the wound, stitching the flesh, and applying a poultice that smelled of mustard and sage. She is strong, Harrison said finally, wiping his hands on a rag. The fever is high, but she has the constitution of iron. She needs rest, Ethan. And so do you. You look like you have been dragged through hell backwards. Ethan stopped pacing, leaning heavily against the doorframe. We are not done with hell yet, Doc. Durand is coming. He has 20 men, maybe more. Harrison paused, his eyes narrowing. Durand. That butcher. I heard he was dead. I wish he were, Ethan replied. He is running guns now. And he knows we are here. Or he will soon. Harrison nodded slowly, absorbing the news without panic. Then we fortify. I have sent my ranch hand, young Tomas, to ride for the high country. There are men up there who owe me their lives. Comanches. If they get the message, we might stand a chance. If not. Harrison let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished, for there was no need to speak the alternative. Night fell over the ranch like a shroud, heavy and absolute. The wind picked up, whistling through the gun ports and rattling the shutters, a mournful sound that mimicked the cries of ghosts. Ethan stood watch on the porch, his eyes straining against the dark, every shadow looking like an assassin. His body was screaming for sleep, but his mind was a hornet's nest of anxiety. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 3 days was draining away, leaving behind a hollow, aching void that demanded to be filled. He went back inside, drawn to the warmth of the hearth in the main room. Harrison was there, sitting in a leather armchair, cleaning a repeater rifle. On the small table between them sat a bottle. It was not the cheap rotgut of the saloon, but a bottle of fine, amber whiskey, the glass catching the firelight and glowing like a trapped sun. Ethan froze. The sight of it hit him harder than a physical blow. His mouth suddenly went dry, his throat constricting, the phantom taste of the liquor flooding his senses. It had been 3 years. 3 years of white-knuckling through the nights, of sweating out the demons, of walking a straight line on a swaying deck. And here it was, salvation and damnation in a single vessel. Harrison watched him, his expression unreadable. For the pain, the doctor said softly, his voice devoid of judgment. If we are to die tomorrow, Ethan, there is no shame in facing it with a warm belly. A man fights better when his hands are steady. Ethan stared at the bottle. He could almost hear the cork popping, could imagine the burn of the first swallow, the glorious, numbing warmth that would wash away the fear, the guilt, the memory of his wife's face, the terror of what might happen to Lona. It would be so easy. Just one drink. Just to steady the hands. He took a step forward, his hand trembling as he reached out. The bottle seemed to pulse, a living thing calling him home. Ethan, a voice whispered from the doorway. He stopped, his hand hovering inches from the glass neck. He turned slowly. Lona was standing there, leaning against the frame for support. She should have been in bed, but she had risen, drawn by a sense that the real battle was being fought right here in this room. She looked pale, her hair loose around her shoulders, but her eyes were clear and burning with a fierce intelligence. She did not look at the bottle, she looked only at him. She saw the hunger in his face, the desperation of an addict on the precipice. She did not speak of the alcohol. She did not preach. She simply walked into the room, her steps unsteady but determined, and closed the distance between them. She took his hand, the one reaching for the whiskey, and pulled it toward her, placing his palm flat against her chest, right over her heart. "Feel this," she whispered, her voice husky with fever and emotion. "This is beating because of you. This is real. The whiskey is a ghost, Ethan. It promises everything and gives nothing. But this is life." Ethan felt the steady, rhythmic thrum of her heart beneath his calloused palm. He felt the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her shift. He looked into her eyes and saw not judgment, but a plea for him to stay present, to stay with her, to not retreat into the fog just when she needed him most. The contrast was shattering. The cold, smooth glass of the bottle versus the warm, living flesh of the woman. The numbness of oblivion versus the terrifying, beautiful pain of being alive. Ethan looked back at the bottle one last time. It sat there, a golden idol demanding sacrifice. Then he looked at Lona. The choice was not between drinking and not drinking, it was between the past and the future. Slowly, agonizingly, Ethan withdrew his hand from her chest and reached for the bottle. Harrison tensed, watching. Lona held her breath. Ethan grasped the neck of the bottle, the glass cool against his skin. He lifted it, the amber liquid sloshing heavily. And then, with a movement so sudden it made Harrison jump, Ethan turned and hurled the bottle into the stone fireplace. The glass shattered with a violent crash, the alcohol exploding into a blue and orange fireball that roared up the chimney, consuming the temptation in a single, purifying breath. Silence returned to the room, broken only by the crackle of the flames. Harrison let out a long breath, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Better an angry man than a drunk one," the doctor murmured, standing up and taking his rifle. "I will take the first watch on the roof. You two, get some rest." When the doctor was gone, the house felt vast and intimate all at once. The adrenaline of the choice had left Ethan shaking, but this time, it was a different kind of tremor. Lona watched him, her eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. "You stayed," she said simply. Ethan turned to her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his scarred face. "I am tired of running, Lona. I am tired of hiding in a bottle. If I die tomorrow, I want to know it. I want to see it coming." Lona stepped closer, wincing slightly as her wound pulled, but she did not stop until she was standing toe to toe with him. "Then you must live tonight," she whispered. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the rough stubble against her smooth skin. The barrier of the unspoken, which had held them apart in the cave and in the hotel, finally crumbled. There was no more time for hesitation, no more luxury of propriety. Death was riding toward them from the horizon, and its approach stripped away everything but the essential truth of their need. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, careful of her injury, but holding her with a desperation that bordered on pain. When he kissed her, it was not gentle. It was a collision of souls, a frantic attempt to merge two broken lives into something whole before the end. Lona met him with equal force, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him down to her. In the flickering light of the hearth, amidst the smell of wood smoke and the looming threat of dawn, they found a sanctuary in each other. They sank to the rug before the fire, the world outside ceasing to exist. There were no words, for words were too small for this. There was only the friction of skin, the ragged sound of breath, the taste of salt and sweat. It was an act of defiance against the death that waited outside the walls. Every touch was a claim, every kiss a promise that they were here, they were alive, and they belonged to the earth and to each other. Later, as the fire burned down to embers, they lay tangled together, Lona's head resting on Ethan's chest. The wind still howled outside, but the terror had receded, replaced by a strange, crystalline clarity. Ethan stroked her hair, staring at the ceiling beams. He thought of the map, of the weapons, of the war that Durand wanted to start. He thought of the badge he had thrown away and the honor he had tried to drown. But mostly, he thought of the woman in his arms, who had been cast out by her own people and hunted by his, and yet possessed more courage in her little finger than he had found in 1,000 bottles. "I will not let them take you," Ethan whispered into the darkness, a vow made to the silence. Lona shifted, pressing a kiss to the scar over his heart. "Then we fight," she murmured sleepily. "And if we fall together. But we do not run. Not anymore." Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the wind, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he fell into a sleep that was dreamless and deep, the sleep of a man who has made his peace with his demons and is ready to face the devil himself when the sun comes up. The dawn broke over the Oscura mountains not with the promise of a new day, but like a bruise spreading across the sky, streaks of violet and angry crimson bleeding into the fading gray of the night. The wind had died down, leaving behind a silence so profound that the click of Ethan Graves checking the loading gate of his Colt Peacemaker sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. He stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the horizon where the chaparral met the sky, his eyes narrowed against the rising glare. Behind him, Dr. Harrison was methodically lining up shotgun shells on the railing, his movements precise and calm, the muscle memory of a field surgeon preparing for an amputation. Lona sat in a chair by the door, her face pale and drawn from the fever that still simmered in her blood, but her Winchester rifle rested across her knees, and her grip on the walnut stock was white-knuckled and steady. There was no talk of her hiding in the cellar, they had passed the point of protecting the weak. Today, everyone bled, or everyone died. The sun had barely cleared the peaks when the first dust cloud appeared, a brown smudge rising against the blue. It grew rapidly, resolving into the shapes of riders, men on horseback moving with the disciplined formation of a wolf pack. There were 20 of them, perhaps more, a small army of mercenaries and hired guns led by the man who had haunted Ethan's nightmares for a decade. Durand rode at the front, sitting tall in his saddle, his duster flaring out behind him, a man who believed his own legend. They stopped 200 yards from the gate, just out of effective rifle range, a line of dark silhouettes against the morning light. Ethan stepped off the porch and walked to the heavy timber gate, sliding the bolt back. Harrison called out a warning, but Ethan ignored it. He pushed the gate open and walked out into the open ground, his boots crunching on the gravel, stopping when he was 50 yards from the enemy line. He stood alone, a solitary figure in a faded duster, offering himself as a focal point to buy the others time. Durand laughed, a sound that carried clearly across the dry air, and spurred his horse forward, flanked by 2 of his lieutenants. "Mornin', Graves," Durand called out, his voice smooth and mocking. "You look like a man who has run out of road." Ethan watched him come, his hands hanging loose by his sides. "The road ends for all of us eventually, Durand," he replied, his voice flat and hard. "Turn around. Walk away. This does not have to be a massacre." Durand threw his head back and laughed again, a sharp, barking sound. "A massacre? You are one broken-down scout, an old pill roller, and a wounded squaw. I have 20 men who get paid by the head. Hand over the map and the girl, and maybe I will let you die quick. Otherwise, we burn this place to the ground and sift your ashes for the gold." Ethan did not blink. "It is not gold, Durand. And you know it. It is death. You want to start a war." Durand shrugged, pulling a cigar from his pocket and lighting it with a casual arrogance. "War is just business, Ethan. And business is booming. General Vasquez pays in silver for those rifles. What do I care if the border burns? I will be in Paris by then. He signaled to his men, and the line of riders unholstered their weapons, the sunlight glinting off 20 steel barrels. Ethan took a breath, smelling the sage and the dust. I gave you a chance, he said quietly. Then, he raised his hand, not to his gun, but in a closed fist that he suddenly opened. From the ridges overlooking the valley, the earth seemed to explode. The silence was shattered not by gunfire, but by the war cry of the Comanche. Harrison had been right, debts in the territory were not always paid in coin. Charlie Two Feathers and a dozen of his braves rose from the rocks where they had been lying in wait since before dawn, their silhouettes breaking the skyline. They did not have the numbers of Durand's men, but they had the high ground and the element of terror. A volley of rifle fire rained down from the cliffs, tearing through the ranks of the mercenaries. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. The disciplined line disintegrated into chaos. Ethan moved instantly. As Durand's horse bucked, panicked by the sudden noise, Ethan drew his Colt. He did not fire wildly, he fired with the cold precision of a machine. His first shot took the lieutenant on the right out of the saddle. His second shattered the knee of the man on the left. Durand struggled to control his mount, cursing, reaching for his own ivory-handled revolver. But he was too slow, and his arrogance had made him careless. Ethan stood his ground amidst the kicking dust and flying lead, aiming steadily. You betrayed your men, Ethan shouted over the roar of the battle. You left us to die in that canyon. Durand finally cleared leather, his face twisted in a rictus of hate, but Ethan fired a split second sooner. The heavy .45 caliber slug struck Durand in the chest, punching him backward off his horse. He hit the ground hard, his gun flying from his hand, the cigar still smoldering in the dirt beside him. The battle was short and brutal. Caught between the crossfire from the ranch house, where Lona and Harrison were firing with deadly accuracy, and the Comanche on the ridges, the mercenaries broke. Those who could ride turned and fled back toward the desert, those who could not lay groaning in the dirt. Silence returned to the valley as quickly as it had left, heavier now, weighted down by the smell of black powder and copper blood. Ethan walked slowly to where Durand lay gasping, pink froth bubbling on his lips. The man looked up at Ethan, his eyes wide with the shock of mortality. You fool, Durand wheezed, clutching his chest. You think, this saves, anything? The army, they know. Ethan holstered his gun, looking down at the dying man with no pity, only a weary exhaustion. It is over, Durand. And he turned his back as the light faded from his enemy's eyes. Ethan walked back to the ranch house. Lona met him at the gate, limping, her rifle barrel hot to the touch. She looked at him, and for a moment, amidst the carnage, there was a peace between them. They had won. They had survived against the odds. Harrison came out on the porch, wiping soot from his face, looking at the retreating dust of the Comanche warriors who had vanished as silently as they had arrived, their debt paid in full. We need to secure the mine, Ethan said, his voice raspy. Collapse the entrance. Make sure nobody can get to those weapons. Lona nodded, her hand finding his. Yes. We end it. But before they could take a step toward the horses, a new sound drifted on the wind. It was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a column of riders, distinct from the chaotic scramble of the mercenaries. Ethan spun around, his hand dropping to his gun again. From the east, a column of dust heralded the arrival of the law. A troop of U.S. cavalry, accompanied by 3 men in dark suits wearing the silver stars of the U.S. Marshal Service, rode into the valley. They moved with the pomp and circumstance of authority, their uniforms crisp, their horses fresh. The lead marshal, a man with a face like a tombstone and eyes that held no warmth, held up a hand to halt the column. He looked over the battlefield, the bodies of Durand's men, and then his gaze settled on Ethan and Lona. Graves? The marshal asked, his voice dry and devoid of inflection. Ethan nodded, stepping forward, his hand moving away from his gun. Sheriff Blackwood is dead, Marshal. Durand is dead. We stopped them. They were running guns to the Mexican rebels. The marshal dismounted slowly, walking over to Durand's body. He nudged it with his polished boot, then looked up at Ethan. We know. We have been watching Durand for months. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Watching? You let him kill innocent people. You let him hunt us. Why? The marshal dusted off his gloves. To find the cache, Graves. We knew he was looking for the lost Confederate shipment. We just needed someone to lead him to it. Or rather, someone to lead us to it. His eyes shifted to Lona, cold and predatory. And the girl provided the map. Ethan stepped in front of Lona, shielding her. The weapons are dangerous, Marshal. They need to be destroyed. We were going to seal the mine. The marshal signaled to his men, and a dozen soldiers raised their carbines, aiming not at the dead mercenaries, but at Ethan and Harrison. Destroy federal property? I do not think so. The Department of War has a use for those rifles. The Apache bands in the South are getting restless. It seems fitting that we use their own stockpile to put them down. The horror of the statement hung in the air, a betrayal far more profound than Durand's greed. UCA not, Lona cried out, stepping from behind Ethan. My father hid them to stop the war. The marshal sneered. Your father was a thief. And you are a savage in possession of stolen government property. Arrest them. No. Ethan roared, his hand flashing for his Colt. But he was tired, and they were ready. A rifle but swung from the side, connecting with his temple with a sickening crack. Ethan hit the ground, the world spinning into darkness. He struggled to rise, his vision swimming, but a heavy boot slammed into his back, driving the air from his lungs. He watched, helpless, his face pressed into the dirt, as two soldiers grabbed Lona. She fought them like a lioness, biting and kicking, screaming Ethan's name, but they were too strong. They twisted her arms behind her back and shackled her wrists with heavy iron cuffs. Ethan, she screamed, the sound tearing at his soul. Ethan. The marshal stood over Ethan, looking down with a sneer. Ethan Graves, you are under arrest for the murder of these citizens, he gestured to the mercenaries, and for conspiracy to incite insurrection. You will hang, cowboy. And the girl, she goes to the reservation prison at Fort Sumner. If she survives the trip. Ethan tried to crawl toward her, his fingers digging into the earth, dragging his body forward by sheer will. Lona. He shouted, his voice breaking. But the soldiers dragged her away, hoisting her onto a horse, tying her legs beneath the belly. She looked back at him, her face streaked with tears and dust, her eyes burning with a mixture of love and an agonizing, bottomless betrayal, not by him, but by the world they had tried to save. The marshal mounted his horse, tipping his hat to the battered, bleeding Ethan. That is the thing about the law, Graves, he said, turning his horse toward the mountains where the mine lay waiting. It is written by the winners. And you are just history. Ethan lay in the dust, watching the column ride away, taking the woman he loved and the weapons that would destroy her people. Doc Harrison sat on the porch steps, handcuffed and bleeding, his head in his hands. The silence of the valley returned, but the peace was gone forever. The rattlesnake was not in the rocks, nor in the saloon. The snake was the star on the marshal's chest, the cold, calculating bite of a civilization that devoured its own heroes. Ethan pounded his fist into the dirt, a scream of impotent rage building in his chest, echoing off the canyon walls, unanswered, unheard, and utterly alone.